Welcome, fellow citizens of YouTube. I am Based, and today we're gonna talk about the people claiming that the Ukrainian offensive has already failed. Actually, a very interesting topic now that the offensive is actually going on. But yeah, I'm gonna give my opinion on that. So, Ukraine, for the last around 3 days, has attacked pretty much all along the front in Zaporozhye, especially at Velika Novosylka and this area, and in this area around Orikhiv here. And the Ukrainian forces have been largely destroyed and have been largely unsuccessful at gaining any real territorial gains. So, does that mean the offensive has failed? Obviously no. It's only the third day, and the forces Ukraine sent in there were very special brigades. Ukraine has plenty of brigades. They only committed to the offensive operations just a few brigades, and yes, they failed. But not that much equipment was destroyed, especially not the super high-tech equipment, and not that many men became casualties. The Russians claimed, I think on July 7th, that the Ukrainian attacks caused themselves around 3,000 casualties. 3,000 casualties is a considerable amount, but the Ukrainians can totally deal with 3,000 casualties. And 3,000 casualties doesn't mean they've all been killed. Many of them have just been a little bit wounded. And that's what the Russians say. So those numbers are of course over-exaggerated. So every time the Ukrainians claim they've killed 10,000 Russian soldiers, they've probably killed 5,000 or something. And every time the Russians claim they've killed 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers, they've probably killed 5,000 or something. So those numbers are over-exaggerated. So it's probably like 2,000 casualties, let's say. And Ukraine can absorb that. And the attacks we've seen were pretty like smaller attacks. Yesterday there were some bigger, more relevant, considerable attacks, but they were all like smaller reconnaissance kind of attacks. So Ukraine is probably just testing the waters and trying to find small points for a breakthrough and not finding them. Because Russia has fortified the shit out of this area for the last months. Because this offensive was highly expected. So I have a little theory about this being a diversion, about the Ukrainians not being suicidal and crashing into fortified positions, but just acting like they're going through with this offensive and attacking somewhere else. Could be, but maybe they just think they can go through those fortified positions. The people have laughed at the Russians, that the Russians are so fucking stupid that they're not able to take the fortified positions and cities of the Ukrainians, and thought the Ukrainians are gonna make taking fortified positions look easy. No, it's not easy. It's not easy for anyone unless the enemy really doesn't want to fight. Like look at Iraq war or something. Yeah, then you can take fortified positions if the enemy doesn't want to fight at all, and if you have really overwhelming firepower and manpower. But in this case, that's not the case for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians don't have overwhelming firepower. They don't really have overwhelming manpower. Yeah, and the Russians are not the Iraqis. They at least kinda want to fight. Even the Mobiks are incentivized to fight, because behind them, tactics both the Russians and Ukrainians are probably using, is behind the mobilized soldiers that probably don't have any wish for dying on the Ukrainian front. If they retreat from their trenches, from their frontline trenches and run away, then there are soldiers behind them, most of the time the Chechens, that will shoot at them. So the soldiers are more scared of the Chechens behind them shooting at them, so they'll just stay in the trenches and shoot at the Ukrainians. And that's the thing. And you don't really have to train mobilized soldiers that much to defend a trench. Training a soldier to become very effective in offensive operations, for that you have to train him a very long time. He has to gain some experience, and he has to be a very competent guy all around. But for sitting in a trench and telling him to do shooty if Ukroman comes along, and if Ukroman has a tank, then you take the rocket launcher and do shooty at the tank, and if the artillery comes in, then you do head down and if artillery is gone, then you do shooty again. That's not very complicated. And that's how Ukraine held back the Russians for the most part of this war. From the start of the war, Ukraine relied on tons of numbers of mobilized, pretty much untrained soldiers to defend against the Russians. And the Russians often actually had pretty trained soldiers. Like, not elite soldiers, but fairly well trained soldiers. But it's still very, very hard to, get a trench. If there's a soldier in there with a gun that knows how to shoot, doesn't matter how trained he is. So, attacking fortified positions is very hard. The Russians have fortified the shit out of this, but the Ukrainians also didn't really commit large amounts of their forces. Just a few brigades with smaller scale attacks to test the waters and maybe achieve a little breakthrough, which they didn't do. So they probably underestimate the Russians a little bit. And the Russians have clearly shown themselves to be able to adapt, because the Russian army from 1 year ago wouldn't have stood against a big Ukrainian offensive. But the Russians now doesn't even lose a few cities against the Ukrainian offensive. So that shows the Russians have evolved and became a way, way more functional army. But a little diversion. In Bakhmut, the Ukrainians have actually been pretty successful in the last few days. At the same time they attacked in Zaporozhye and were unsuccessful, they've attacked in Bakhmut and they've captured territory here, pretty much all around the frontier. Here, and this is the most important push towards Berchivka. And if they get Berchivka and, go to Paraskovivka, then they cut off, first of all, the northern road to Bakhmut, but they also make this a salient and, squeeze the people out of here or encircle them very, very quickly. And then there is an opening for a breakthrough to encircle Bakhmut. Pretty much the same thing the Russians tried to do here, the Ukrainians are maybe trying to do here to get Bakhmut back. Even though I don't really know why they should be doing that. Because even if they capture Bakhmut, that won't be changing the war. Bakhmut is way more important for the Russians than for the Ukrainians. But maybe the Ukrainian tactic is just hold on to Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, those fortresses, and Bakhmut, the fortresses in this area the Russians really have to capture, to hold on to them as long as possible. And yeah, maybe those attacks in Zaporozhye are just a diversion, so the good Russian units go to Zaporozhye. So the Ukrainians have an easier time getting back Bakhmut. But Bakhmut has been largely destroyed, so the fortifications there, the buildings there, aren't really that good at defending anymore. But yeah, this is just a theory. If this is the Ukrainian strategy in this war, holding on to this easily defendable area here that I talked about a million times, and just keep defending against the Russians, then this would be a great, great diversion to get back Bakhmut and waste the Russians' time this summer. Because if the Russians push up here towards Zaporozhye, that's not horrible for the Ukrainians. But if the Russians manage to capture Slavyansk, Kramatorsk and Kostiantynivka, then the war looks very bad for the Ukrainians, especially in the east. And the east is what the Russians care about. The east is where the Russians caused themselves a lot of casualties to capture a few cities. So, the Ukrainians are doing a little pincer here, it seems like. It's developing now. It's not there yet. And the Ukrainians are doing the same thing here. So, this seems like it could be developing into a pincer around Bakhmut. Very interesting development, and that's actually the part of the front where the Ukrainians are actually successful at their offensive, at their summer offensive against Russia. But yeah, this is not the big offensive. And if it is the big offensive, then it is miserable. Goodbye.